Imagine this. You're a billionaire with everything at your disposal: luxury, power, and influence. But there's one thing you can't control: the person your daughter chooses to spend her life with. Now, what if you could test his character without him even knowing? What if you could see how he acts when he thinks no one's watching? Pause for a brief moment. Music intensifies slightly. That's exactly what one billionaire did. Disguising himself as a simple waiter, he set out to test his daughter's boyfriend. But what happened next? Well, it's nothing short of shocking. The billionaire father, let's call him Thomas, is a man who built his fortune from the ground up. Known for his sharp business mind and meticulous attention to detail, Thomas has always prided himself on making informed decisions. But when it came to his daughter Emily, all that precision seemed to go out the window. Emily was in her mid-20s, successful in her own right, and incredibly independent. But there was one thing she hadn't quite figured out: her choice of men. Enter Jake, her boyfriend. Jake seemed charming at first, a little rough around the edges, but he had that good guy vibe. He treated Emily well, but something about him didn't sit right with Thomas. Thomas had met countless people over the years, and his instincts about people were usually spot on. Jake had a way of smiling just a little too much, a little too often, and though he was polite, he seemed to avoid any real deep conversations. To Thomas, that was a red flag. It wasn't about wealth or status. He didn't care where Jake came from. But there was a nagging feeling that Jake wasn't as genuine as he appeared. As a father, Thomas wanted the best for Emily. He didn't want her to end up with someone who wasn't fully invested in her, or who might take advantage of her in the long run. But how could he be sure? Emily had told him that Jake was different. She said he was kind, loyal, and trustworthy. But the more Thomas watched, the more uncertain he became. After months of observing Jake, Thomas knew he couldn't sit back any longer. If he wanted to protect his daughter's future, he had to act. But rather than confronting Jake directly, Thomas wanted to see what kind of person Jake really was when he thought no one was watching. That's when the idea struck him. He would disguise himself as a simple waiter at a restaurant, a place where Jake and Emily were planning to dine. He would watch how Jake treated the staff, how he spoke to others, and how he behaved when he thought he was in the company of strangers. Thomas didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he was determined to find out the truth, no matter how far he had to go. Thomas knew that pulling off this plan required more than just slipping into a uniform. It wasn't enough to simply put on a waiter's apron and serve food. He needed to blend in seamlessly, to be just another face in the crowd. So he spent days researching the perfect persona. First, he visited a few upscale restaurants under the guise of scouting locations. He observed the waiters closely, how they moved, how they spoke, the little things that made them seem professional and approachable. He picked up on their subtle mannerisms, the way they greeted customers, how they held the tray, how they made small talk without interrupting the flow of the meal. It wasn't just about being efficient. It was about being invisible, blending into the background while still offering excellent service. Next, he bought the clothes: a crisp white shirt, a black apron, and comfortable black shoes that didn't squeak on the floor. He practiced his posture in the mirror, working on standing tall but not too rigid, leaning in slightly when speaking, and always keeping his smile just polite enough to be friendly without overdoing it. He didn't want to be memorable. He just wanted to be there. Finally, he reached out to a local restaurant that he knew had a good reputation and hired himself on as a part-time waiter for the night. It was a small place, intimate enough that the staff knew each other well, but busy enough to keep the focus off any one person. Thomas made sure to choose a night when the restaurant was less crowded, but still had a steady stream of customers. The perfect balance. The night arrived. Thomas, now fully suited in his waiter's uniform, arrived early to make sure everything was in place. He went over the menu one more time and memorized the specials. He knew this night wasn't just about serving food. It was about observing every move, every word exchanged. As Emily and Jake entered the restaurant, Thomas greeted them at the door, using a practiced neutral smile. His heart raced, but he kept his composure. The couple sat down at a cozy corner table, completely unaware of who he was. He took their drink orders, speaking politely but keeping the conversation minimal, just enough to move the night along without raising suspicion. As he walked away, he took a moment to watch them. Emily was glowing, clearly comfortable with Jake. But Thomas wasn't fooled by the surface. He moved through the restaurant, checking on other tables, but always keeping an eye on his daughter and her boyfriend. Every glance, every laugh, every small gesture that Jake made, Thomas was paying attention. When he returned with their food, he made sure to observe the way Jake interacted with him. Was he polite? Was he respectful? Or did he take his service for granted, dismissing him as just another invisible person in the background? Jake's words were casual, but Thomas noticed how his tone shifted when he wasn't directly engaging with Emily. It was subtle, but it was there. As the evening progressed, Thomas watched closely, careful not to make his presence too obvious. The first real test came when Jake, while in the middle of a story, raised his voice slightly, laughing a little too loudly, making a joke at the expense of the waiter, a remark that could easily be brushed off as playful. But Thomas noticed the way Jake looked around, scanning the room, as if to gauge whether anyone was paying attention. His gaze lingered just a moment too long on the other patrons, eyes darting from one person to another, almost as if checking to see who was watching. Thomas observed how Jake interacted with the restaurant staff throughout the meal. He wasn't outright rude, but there was something about his demeanor, a subtle, condescending tone when he ordered the wine, the slight smirk when his food arrived a little later than expected. He didn't outright demand anything, but his impatience was evident in the way he sighed, tapping his fingers against the table as if it were an inconvenience to wait. Meanwhile, Emily remained unaware of her boyfriend's behavior. She seemed completely at ease, laughing at Jake's jokes, nodding along as he spoke about his day. She occasionally shot Thomas a warm smile when he refilled her glass, but nothing more than a polite acknowledgement. She didn't seem to notice the discomfort that was growing in the air. Her attention was solely focused on Jake, who, at that moment, had a way of making everything feel lighthearted. But Thomas noticed. There were moments when Jake would shift his tone, becoming less interested in the conversation, more focused on the impression he was leaving. He would pause before responding, as if carefully choosing his words, then deliver them with a rehearsed confidence. Thomas could tell it wasn't the kind of natural flow one might expect from someone who genuinely cared about the conversation. It felt calculated. As the night went on, Emily seemed to grow more animated in her responses. She was completely engrossed in Jake, her eyes softening every time he spoke, hanging on his words. She didn't seem to catch the slight dismissiveness in Jake's mannerisms, the way he would subtly shift his body when the conversation took a turn he didn't like. Every now and then, when their laughter filled the air, Thomas could see a flicker of hesitation in Jake's smile, a fleeting moment of uncertainty. But to Emily, the evening felt perfect. She saw Jake as charming, a man with a quick wit and an easy smile, someone who knew how to make her feel special. She didn't notice that he had barely acknowledged the waiter's presence beyond the necessity of ordering. The few times Thomas had served them, Jake would glance up with the barest hint of acknowledgement, then quickly return to Emily, as if to avoid a real interaction. It wasn't overtly rude, but it was cold, calculated. As the meal drew to a close, Emily seemed happy. Her face was flushed, her voice light, and she was focused on Jake. She thanked Thomas for the meal, still unaware of his true identity, her politeness seemingly genuine but almost robotic. She smiled at him, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that, in that moment, Emily had become blind to everything else in the room. She was caught up in the idea of what Jake represented, and in her world there was nothing more to question. As the night came to a close, the tension in Thomas's chest grew heavier. He had seen enough. Jake's behavior was far from what he had hoped for, and the way Emily was still completely unaware only made it more urgent. Thomas had been playing the role of the waiter all evening, but now he knew it was time to end the game. He approached their table for the final time, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the soft clink of glasses, the murmur of other patrons, but all of it felt distant, like an echo in the background. This was the moment he would finally reveal who he truly was. He placed the check on the table in front of them, carefully making sure to keep his face neutral. "Thank you for dining with us tonight," Thomas said softly, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. Then, without missing a beat, he straightened up and slowly peeled off the waiter's apron, revealing the sleek suit underneath. Jake blinked, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second as he tried to process what had just happened. The smile he had been wearing slipped from his face. "Wait a second," he stammered, looking back at Thomas in confusion. You're not?" Thomas watched as the realization hit Jake, a mix of surprise and discomfort flashing across his face. The man who had been treating him like just another waiter now stood before him, a figure of power, wealth, and authority. His instinctive smile faltered, his eyes darting around, clearly struggling to find the right words. Emily, who had been laughing lightly at something Jake had said, suddenly stopped, her expression shifting from carefree joy to utter confusion. She turned to Thomas, then back at Jake, sensing something was off but not yet fully understanding. "Dad?" Her voice trembled, a quiet shock lingering in the air. "What's going on?" Thomas looked at his daughter for a moment, his face unreadable. "I'm Thomas," he said, simply, letting the words hang in the air. The silence in the restaurant seemed to stretch, thick with disbelief. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping the table nervously as he avoided eye contact with either of them. His confident demeanor from earlier was now gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem small and unsure. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first, as if he were trying to process the unexpected turn of events. Emily's eyes searched her father's face, looking for some sign of what had just happened. "What do you mean, Dad?" Her voice was soft, a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Why would you do this?" Thomas took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't lie to her. "I had to know, Emily. I had to know what kind of person he really was." His eyes flicked to Jake, whose discomfort had turned into full-blown panic. "I wanted to see how he treated others when he didn't think anyone was watching." The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emily's gaze shifted from her father to Jake, her expression softening with the realization of what had just occurred. Jake's face turned pale, his earlier confidence now shattered into pieces. What was this? Some kind of test? Jake finally managed to speak, his words tight with frustration. "You didn't trust me from the start, did you?" Thomas remained calm, but his voice was firm. "I trusted my instincts, and tonight they told me everything I needed to know." Emily sat back, the shock still lingering in her eyes as the weight of the revelation slowly settled into her. She wasn't sure what to say. The man she thought she knew, the man she had stood by for months, had now been revealed as something very different. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the tension in the air suffocating. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing at Emily before focusing on Thomas. His face had flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, his earlier composure long gone. This is insane," Jake said, his voice shaky, though he was trying to regain control. "I didn't deserve this. I came here to have a nice evening with Emily, and now I'm being treated like some kind of fraud." He looked at Thomas, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm not good enough for her?" Emily's expression shifted, her confusion turning into concern. She didn't know what to make of Jake's words or the way he was reacting. "Jake, stop. What do you mean?" she asked softly. Jake's gaze darted between her and her father. He could feel the weight of the moment crushing him, but he refused to let it show. I don't know what you want from me, Thomas. I've been respectful. I've treated your daughter with nothing but care. He hesitated for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. I'm just trying to be a good guy here. And this feels like a test I can't pass, no matter what I do. Thomas stared at him, unflinching. It's not about passing some test, Jake. It's about showing your true character. The way you treat people when you think they don't matter. The waiter, the staff, anyone you don't see as important. That's who you really are. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but for a moment, words failed him. He was caught in the act, his true nature laid bare in the way he had behaved throughout the night. But he quickly found his footing again, his voice sharper. So, what? You think I was pretending? You think I was acting like someone I'm not? Maybe I was just trying to make a good impression, huh? It's not easy, when you're meeting the father of someone you care about. Thomas's jaw tightened. If you were pretending, then I don't want you to be with my daughter. And if you can't handle being yourself, then maybe you're not ready for what comes with being with her. Emily had been quiet up until this point, her eyes flickering between the two men. She could feel the distance growing, the invisible wall between them becoming higher by the second. She turned to her father, her voice steady but laced with a quiet hurt. Dad, I can't believe you did this. Why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you trust me to make my own decisions? Thomas's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He had never wanted to hurt her, but he couldn't shake the worry he had felt. He took a step closer to her, his tone softer. I trusted you, Emily, but I also trust my instincts. I saw things tonight. Things that made me question whether Jake truly respects you or the life you're building. And, as your father, it's my job to protect you, even if that means doing something you might not understand. Emily shook her head, the disappointment clear on her face. You went behind my back, Dad. That's what hurts the most. I had no idea you didn't trust me. The words stung, and Thomas felt them deeply. He had thought he was doing the right thing, but seeing the hurt in Emily's eyes made him question everything. Jake, still seething, leaned back in his chair. I don't need this. I came here to prove I'm good enough for her, but clearly I'm never going to be. So if you want to make this decision for her, fine. But don't act like you're the only one who cares about her. Emily's eyes softened slightly, but she still wasn't sure what to feel. She had seen a side of Jake tonight that unsettled her, but the betrayal of her father's secret plan weighed heavily on her heart. She turned to her father, her voice now quiet, almost lost. I don't know what to believe anymore, Dad. The weight of her words hung in the air. There was no immediate answer, just a room full of unsaid things, emotions that had been brought to the surface, and two people, father and daughter, caught in a whirlwind of trust, doubt, and hard truths. The tension in the air remained thick, but as the minutes passed, the silence between father and daughter began to speak louder than anything else. Emily sat still, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes lost in thought. She hadn't said much since the confrontation, and Thomas could tell she was still processing everything. Jake, on the other hand, was visibly upset. He had attempted to explain himself one last time, but his words seemed to fall flat. It was clear to Thomas that Jake wasn't going to change overnight, and perhaps he wasn't the man he had hoped he would be for his daughter. But it wasn't about changing Jake. It was about Emily. Her happiness, her trust, and her understanding of the world around her were what mattered most. After a long pause, Emily finally spoke, her voice softer now, but filled with uncertainty. I don't know what to do, Dad, she said, looking between him and Jake. I care about him, but I can't ignore what I saw tonight. You went too far. Her eyes welled up with unshed tears, but she quickly wiped them away. But I don't want to make decisions for him either. I need to figure this out myself. Thomas's heart broke. He had done what he thought was necessary to protect her, but the way he had gone about it had only created more questions, more distance between them. He could see the strain it was causing, both in Emily's voice and in the quiet, uncomfortable space between her and Jake. Jake's voice, now softer, cut through the quiet. Look, I'm sorry if I came across the wrong way. I don't like being tested, but I do care about Emily. I want her to know that. Emily didn't respond immediately. She looked at him, her face conflicted, trying to reconcile her feelings with what she had just witnessed. She didn't know if Jake truly was the person she thought he was. His behavior during the test had shown a side of him she hadn't seen before, and it left her wondering if she had been blind to other signs. But as the evening wore on, she realized there was more to consider than just what had happened during that meal. There was her relationship with her father, too, one that had been built on trust, but also on respect. And at that moment, Emily had to make a choice. She needed to trust her own instincts, to be honest with herself about what she wanted and deserved. After a long pause, Emily stood up. She looked at Jake one last time, her face serious but calm. "I think it's time for us to take a break," she said quietly. "I need to figure things out. We've been rushing through things, and I need space to think." Jake's face darkened, but he nodded slowly. "I get it," he said, his voice low. "I'll give you that space, but don't think I'm giving up on us." Emily didn't answer, but her eyes softened. She wasn't sure if they would get back together or if this was the end, but she knew she had to follow her instincts, even if they led her down a difficult path. Thomas watched quietly as the couple exchanged a final glance. He knew he hadn't won any favors with Emily tonight, but he also knew she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was capable of making her own decisions, even if it meant learning the hard way, and he would be there for her, no matter what she decided. As the night came to a close, Emily turned to her father. "I don't agree with what you did, but I know you only did it because you care about me. I don't know if I'm making the right choice, but I need to figure this out on my own." Thomas nodded, a heavy weight on his shoulders. "I understand, and no matter what you decide, I'm here for you." In that moment, the family dynamic had shifted. The test, though harsh and painful, had uncovered deeper truths about trust, boundaries, and the lengths a parent would go to protect their child. But it also reminded Thomas that Emily was her own person now, capable of standing on her own 2 feet. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They would face it together, even if it meant taking difficult steps along the way. In the end, Thomas's bold decision to disguise himself as a waiter and test his daughter's boyfriend led to a night filled with unexpected revelations. His instincts, though driven by a desire to protect Emily, put him in a difficult position. The way Jake treated the restaurant staff and his subtle actions spoke volumes to Thomas, but it also sparked a painful conversation that no one saw coming. Emily, caught between the man she cared for and the father who only wanted to keep her safe, faced an emotional crossroads. Jake, though clearly shaken, tried to defend his actions, but it was too late. Emily needed space to figure out what she truly wanted, and she chose to take a step back from the relationship to reflect on everything that had unfolded. Through it all, one thing became clear. While parents often act out of love and protection, it's equally important to respect the independence of their children and allow them to make their own decisions, even if that means learning from their own experiences. The test, though harsh, had its own lessons for everyone involved. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think of Thomas's decision to test Jake in this way? Was it an overstep, or was he right to protect his daughter? And what about Emily? How would you have handled this situation if you were in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories like this one.